About 2 months ago, Council was deciding the 10-year budget to underpin the first 10 years of the 30-year plan. And it was there was a bit of an old guard pushback by some of the councillors who wanted to strip out all sorts of stuff, all the strategic investment stuff, and on the grounds that some neighbourhoods couldn't handle the rate rises, but that the rate rise is an anomaly. The underlying rate they'll eventually sort out. And what they did was sprinkle a little bit of money. They were suggesting to sprinkle a little bit of money through things like a bit more money for the Harvey Historical Society. So, but the great moment came when Nolene Raffles, who was a true dyed-in-the-wool citizens and ratepayers councillor in the old council, said that she would vote for that amendment, but she was pretty sure it wasn't going to pass. But she was going to vote for it out of solidarity with her old citizens and ratepayers colleagues. But she said, when I put on my big city hat, and now I'm working across the boundaries and into New Lynn, and we are very excited about the new railway station and about people want compact housing and more transport and all the rest. I realised that what the Royal Commission had said, that the right structure could change political culture, was happening before my very eyes. And so I got, to me, that's one of the most telling examples of how this is working. The other one is that I've done a couple of sessions with the local boards on strategic issues, and I've been immensely excited there because there's a huge amount to work out about the relationship between council and the local boards, particularly in getting resources and support right and everything else. But what I am seeing about those local boards is tremendous expression of what they want to achieve locally. And the council working very hard to support them on that. And so that's the other part of this that I think is working. Still a very long way to go, but it is working, which is why I've been very direct about saying that Wellington's got to get itself together along the same way. Now, it's going to be different in other parts of the country, but this concept of a different structure, it's not about amalgamation, but a different structure that can work both at that big strategic level and at that local identity and expression level and real local commitment, to me is actually the new structure and face and culture of local government.
That's a great answer.
I'm really sorry. I'm sorry to go.
You can Thank you. Thank you, Rod. Hey, we'll give you a clap, mate.
In terms of Auckland, there's just one thing that I've often thought about, and that's in respect of how the local boards operate. It's an interesting structure because the local boards are served by people who are employed by the Auckland Council itself and who are accountable to the chief executive of that council. And I have a little bit of a concern first that if there would be significant differences of view between a local board or boards and the governing body or the chief executive, the people advising the local boards are in a somewhat anomalous situation. But secondly, I think that there's an opportunity to lift the profile of local board activity by distancing things a little in order to make them closer. And I'll explain what I mean by that. If you look at London, Greater London Authority, there are 32 boroughs. The boroughs have a lot to do with the GLA, which has a lot of powers in respect of what they do. And their collective interests are represented by something called London Councils, which is an organisation to which the boroughs belong, and it employs the people who do the collective stuff, the research, the representation, the negotiation on matters that are collective across, and they're obviously, of course, accountable to the boroughs, not to the GLA. And I think one thing worth considering for Auckland in terms of strengthening that local democracy side is actually shifting the support resource for the local boards from being employed by and directly accountable to the Auckland Council itself and the chief executive to a separate entity would still have to be funded by the Auckland Council, but whose role was unequivocally to support the local boards and, incidentally, to cut out a lot of the transaction costs in terms of how boards deal with the council. That's just a thought I'd throw in them, because I think the local board structure itself, in terms of long term, is perhaps a little too dependent at the moment, and I'd like to see that shifted a bit.
I'm grace in favour of the chief executive and the council. Yes, I think that they are very reluctant to add another layer because that nightmare of so much. It was a complex situation, and it was the horror show and who did what when the charts were up. Transport linked with this, with that. Nothing worked really well. Now it seems to be going well. The motor is moving. I hear what you're saying, Peter. I think that they'll be a bit reluctant to buy into that second tier because beware of what you want, because you might get it. Robbie wanted something and he got the ARC, if you remember. It was turned into the ARA.
Yeah, I have to say that in part when I say that I'm looking at what I expect to be the ongoing needs for community governance across Auckland, where the local boards represent communities which in one sense are part of a greater whole, but another a very different one from another. And there's a real question about how you support the ability for those boards to be different from the council as a whole.
I see, and I read very much the newspapers of the Auckland region, which are the community newspapers, and the boards figure enormously there. Generally, they're front page. Councillors are not. If you want to know what's going on at the council, buy the Herald or listen to Morning Report. If you want to know what's happening locally about roads that need to be more safety attuned, look at your local papers. Look at the letters. That's where I think the local papers, and I really, because I came out of the world of media and promotion, they are just so important. They tell it what's happening, the angst and the anguish and the triumphs are all there in those local papers. When in 100 years' time, when people say, can we find out what New Zealand was like in 2012, don't go to the Herald or the Waikato Times, go to the local papers. It's the whole life of our communities. I think it's working really well. It's got terrific leadership. They've recognised Ngāti Whātua, which was never really recognised. I mean, generations of mayors in Auckland wouldn't even try Kia ora, which can't be that hard to say. In other words, Māori were distanced from that. Only 2 cities acknowledged Māori, which was South Auckland with Sir Barry Curtis and me out in Waitakere. Len picked up that and set up the Māori Council. It has worked terrifically well with the contributions, if you like. It's a big council. I think there's 12. But right now, I would say it's in balance. Tamahiri's always going to be a problem, but then he has to run and do his radio show. So when it's starting to get a little interesting, he shoots out to join Jackson to abuse people. So, I mean, given that, I'm telling you, as I feel it, that the balance is right. Once you get that balance right, everyone else, I've always believed, comes right. If you don't get that right, no one else knows their place. And particularly in a city like Auckland, where it's hugely multiracial. You know, the Chinese community is huge and exciting. I mean, there's huge events in Auckland. The Lantern Festival, the Dragon Boat Festival, all is taking part. And I reckon it's kind of very much in harmony. Like big cities. Big cities, this is a big city now. You should be a larger city. And it's a celebration of cities. The outcomes, I would think, are supportive of the treaty settlements, which were always a serious issue with the Auckland iwi. All of them are involved in major treaty settlements of the mountains, the prisons, land that was coming back to them. All were in various variances with the Crown. Now they're united, all are getting treaty settlements. I heard on Māori News this morning that they now have, I think, about 2 months to have a consultation period. and then come back to the Crown and say, we'll do the deal. I mean, I'd do the deal. They get 10 air bases, 5 jails, or I'm making it up, but you get 20 mountains, 3 post offices. I'd be involved, wouldn't you? I mean, it's like winning lotto for the next 1,000 years. I mean, the grievances are over. I mean, that kind of stuff slows down the train. And so if you get it right, and if you talk openly and honestly with Māori, you get a great response. And so I'm just very comfortable as a local government, of which I am a representative, to just doing that. The waterfront, we've had the best relationship that I think Auckland's ever had. They had a very difficult relationship because they made it difficult. They never involved Māori. I'm talking of Auckland, Little Auckland. Robbie did, Kath Tizard did. I would think Kath Tizard was the last mayor of Auckland that actually worked a partnership. The rest just fortress mentality. Banks, appalling. Les Mills, same. You look through those mayors, they didn't make it an issue. If I was writing the history, and somebody, Bassett probably is, you'd say they didn't behave very well to new and older partners. Brown is very accessible. And I tell you who does like it, foreign investors. They love that. We've been talking with a number of delegations. We put on a little Māori wero. It works magic because they can't do it. They can never do it. We're the only country in the world that can get up and bless a building at 5 o'clock in the morning with Indigenous people. It's hard work, but boy, does it work. It just is that kind of magical thing that we don't see because we're used to it. But I just think, try it, do it with visitors. They remember it for years afterwards. Look, in Waitakere, when we had groups from China coming, and I'd think, there's another group of Chinese. Who are they? I don't know who the hell they are. Okay, let's get up the council chamber, bring up our guys, bring up the team. We'd all do a few waiatas, and all that wonderful kind of process which pleased us. Now I go back to China. They're running the corporations. We were chasing, I better be honest, we were chasing movie partnerships with our studios. Did that work wonders? They always say to us, you greeted us with Māori people. We go, of course. So it's an investment which pays off. It's called Tips on How to Make Yourself Popular. Councillors, I think, after the leaky buildings saga, have become terribly risk-averse. And it's not an easy kind of thing to say. I think Rod would be very good, but I hear what you're saying. Local government, by its very nature, is a complex machine. But what we're talking about here is, I think, much more simpler than the complexities of the RMA. This is a bigger issue, a more visionary issue we're talking about today. The objective is to be stronger, be more united, and gallop towards the future. But if you want that issue, I think Peter here would gladly pick up that.
One of the concerns I have with local government is that over the years, central governments have taken the view, we're a little bit uncomfortable about this, we'll regulate local government and we'll regulate it a bit more. And the obvious classic, of course, is what actually happened with long-term council community plans and the involvement of the Office of the Auditor General. So that I think one of the areas of complexity that I hope will get reduced, and the second phase of Better Local Government is supposed to address that, is what regulation actually requires of local government in the way which it does its business. I've looked at the development back from the days of the long-term financial strategy and onward, and it seemed to me that there's been an increasing emphasis on getting senior management and elected members to spend more and more of their time doing things which are of less and less value because of distrust from central government. And I think fundamentally that does real damage, not just to local government, but to the communities it deals with and to the strategies it ought to be putting in place to help advance economic and social development. So I'm with you in terms of getting rid of complexity. But in a way, I'm less worried about the RMA than I'm worried about the complexity of government requirements imposed on local government. But again, I guess that comes back to the question of local government building its own sort of reputation with its wider communities as places that people can trust, rather than places that you've got to make sure that they can't move without being tied up in knots in order to make sure they don't do anything sensible. Yeah, it's an interesting question, that, because there are a number of different possible answers. I think the first thing is that the evidence is quite strong. People get very attached to place. You have a look at Bob Parker's 7 or 8 year campaign to get to be mayor of Christchurch, which started with getting Banks Peninsula into Christchurch. And first time round, they chose an approach which gave Christchurch electors a vote. They said no, and then someone had the bright idea that Banks Peninsula should go to the Local Government Commission with a proposal that it be disestablished. No provision in the Act for anyone else to vote on that apart from their own ratepayers, but automatically it meant it would become part of Christchurch. The Local Government Commission did a lot of work analysing the impact on Banks Peninsula people if that happened, including an assumption that in Christchurch the rates provisions that they had would roll out over Banks Peninsula so that they could then work out what would happen to rates. And briefly, the evidence was that all ratepayers in Banks Peninsula would be better off by somewhere between 10% and 40% of their annual rates bill. Christchurch would be able to deal with Banks Peninsula's infrastructure problems. The marina, which had been uninsured marina, which had been destroyed by a storm, could be rebuilt, and so on. So it all looked pretty good. It went to a poll of Banks Peninsula ratepayers alone, and of those who voted, 40% said no. And there's only one rational explanation, that despite the obvious benefits, being Banks Peninsula really mattered. And I think that's how people are. So that's the first point about it. The second is, depending on what you want to do, yes, a larger council can be organised so that you get a lot of strong local democracy. But it's a matter of making sure that you do it. And you can take, for example, look at Queenstown Lakes District Council, where the Wanaka Community Board has a massive set of delegations. And basically, it runs Wanaka. Go to most councils, and the community board is that bloody nuisance that we partly pay for because the remuneration authority says there's a fixed amount of money for governance and half of community board salary is going to be paid out of that. So councillors think, we're paying the community board members, why do we want to do that? Let's get rid of them. So a lot of this is about thinking sensibly about design and about the incentives people will have within different structures. Yes, you can design large councils, and if you put the right representation arrangements in place, and if you design your community governance, and that's robust, then you can get a lot of that local democracy still in place. But most of the evidence about amalgamation is that it doesn't save costs. People will argue that it does. In Auckland now, at the moment, they're saying, yes, it's reduced costs, but 5 years out, let's have a look and see what's happened. Let's see what's happened to service levels. Let's see if the way that salaries have been structured in Auckland Council is sustainable over time. A whole lot of things still need to be looked at. And it's a very disturbing process. I'm in the camp that says shared services can and should work, but there are some major barriers to overcome, including the fact that the evidence tells you that particularly second-tier management and councils don't like it because it cuts their empire down to size. A lot of elected members fear loss of control. And much of that is around, the models that we've used haven't been good models. We're now learning a bit more, and the Waikato and Bay of Plenty local authority shared services companies have some real potential, but those need very careful design as well. So I guess what I'm saying is, yes, you can get strong local democracy within larger councils, but you've really got to know what you're doing, and you've got to make sure that the arrangements you have in place are robust so that when the council and the management who put those in place disappear and their successors come into place, the arrangements persist. On balance, nothing wrong with small councils. I quoted France earlier, British Columbia, median size of municipality 5,000. The provincial government there has taken the view, local democracy matters, we're not going to force people to merge, but they have a very intelligent provincial-wide statutory enabled process for shared services that works extremely well, so they get those economies. The answer is, I guess, think carefully about what you're doing, look at what performance characteristics you want for your total set of arrangements, and make sure that you've got the design skills to put those properly in place, and you'll get both local democracy and efficiency in service delivery. But we haven't really done that here yet. Let's hope this conference starts to kick it off for the Waikato.
Good answer. Thank you.
Perhaps I can ask this of both of you. If we, for one moment, assumed there was a unitary structure for the Waikato put in place, what from your experience of Auckland, do we need to be thinking about to prepare ourselves for that? If that's coming down the road, what are the lessons out of Auckland to prepare properly for it? What are the things you've really got to get right if that's coming down the road?
I think going back to my original thing, is the time right? I think the time is right. Leadership is hugely important, and I think leadership is painful. Leadership is not easy. It's never been easy, and if people pretend leadership is easy, they just don't understand it. It needs a commitment. As Peter said, I thought wisely, it needs space, it needs design, and then it needs a will to do it. And if that will is doing it, you can't jump any gap in 2 jumps. It's got to be done. I mean, we talked in Auckland, wouldn't it be good if we did 2 cities? And it was in the Mayoral Forums, we talked about that for 5 years. Like, it was split down the middle. Dominion Road made a lot of sense, you know, because it kind of comes right from the heart of the city right out to the Manukau. And so everything west and everything south in 2 cities. Curtis really wanted that. And then I was reasonably happy to go into North Shore and Rodney, because I always thought my city was too small and too tight. We didn't have any industrial areas. The rating base was kind of okay. But then I really came back one day and said to Barry, that ain't going to work. 2 cities, just really crazy thinking. It's either one or nothing, and he wasn't very happy with that. But, you know, it was all about patch and base and the old photographs and the mayoral chains. You've got to do a bit of grieving. You know, you can't not, you don't lose your name. Rotorua would still be Rotorua, and I'm sure Tauranga. But Bob Owens, if I remember the old Bob Owens, he was mayor of both the Mount and Tauranga for years, and they all loved him greatly. So the mayor, man or woman, has got to be a very forceful and visionary person. I think the time is for vision and a passion for it. If you don't have those kind of, and charismatic, all those things are important at this time of transition. It's a transition, and if you want it, then I think tell people you want it, and think it up, talk up the idea, but don't talk it up for 5 years, and don't do small. If you want to be in a world, I always say, you know, in the dog-eat-dog world, get a bloody bigger dog.
I think the logic of a single authority for the whole of Auckland was fairly hard to argue against, and that's partly because of what's happening with metropolitan centres internationally. It was very clear that Auckland needed to be brought together as a single entity for a whole bunch of reasons. I'm not sure the same logic necessarily runs for the Waikato, partly because of the place of the peripheral authorities, as I'd call them. Where does someone like TCDC or South Waikato or Waitomo actually sit? So there's an interesting question about how you handle that. And I think the thing that's worth exploring is what, for the Waikato, needs to be done at a regional level, what needs to be done at what I call a district or service delivery level, and what needs to be done at a purely community level. And you need some clarity around that. I'm a believer that we do need stronger regional level governance And that's partly because I think we have got some real shortcomings in areas like economic development, the way critical services like tertiary education, skills training are actually delivered at the moment. They don't relate well to often to the needs of the communities they're serving because there's not enough interplay and there's no dialogue partner for the deliverers of those, the universities and the polytechnics, to work with at a regional level. So I think there's a strong case for a lot of strengthening at that level. I'm less worried about what happens locally, provided that it's designed around principles of efficiency. I like what's happening with Auckland CCOs. They're well designed and they've got a good understanding of the balance between the autonomy to be effective at service delivery and the accountability to the broader community, including the way they work with local boards. And I can see a case for a similar approach to services across the Waikato, but whether that needs to be embedded in a single unitary or whether it's a collaboration between councils is an interesting question. I guess my one qualifier on my own view that I don't see the Auckland model being necessarily replicated here is with the number of territorials in the Waikato, how feasible is it to expect agreement? And that's not a criticism of people in territorials in the Waikato. It's rather that when you're having a strategic conversation about a significant issue, the more different decision makers you have in that conversation, the harder it is for even reasonable people to reach agreement. And the idea of 10 or 11 councils trying to reach agreement on a complex set of organisational arrangements where there are different reasonable options, to me sounds like quite a long journey. So there is an interesting balance, and there is also the question of who actually takes the leadership role. Is it the Waikato Regional Council? To be candid, my experience generally is that territorials are suspicious of regionals, and that's partly structural.
Really?
That's partly structural because of the role that regional councils actually have by statute. Should it be the Mayor of Hamilton, who's sitting there, I hope, listening carefully? Does she take the lead with Hamilton City as the leader? What do the peripheral councils think about that? So there are some really interesting questions about how to structure a dialogue that has a prospect of getting an outcome within an acceptable period of time. And that's one of the risks you face, because if you can't do that, ultimately you may get external intervention. Long answer, because it's a difficult issue. And you'll probably be surprised by my answer, which is, I think there's a different discussion which needs to be had first in relation to rural councils and the burden which the productive sector actually carries. If you look at what's been happening in New Zealand over the past 20 or more years, and Natalie will be covering some of this later, I suspect, in speaking of demographics, we've had really significant increases in agricultural productivity. What has that actually meant in practice? It's meant we've been replacing labour with capital. It's also meant that we've been becoming more technologically sophisticated, so the kind of people we require actually managing our farms now are pretty highly skilled, or need to be highly skilled. They need to be IT capable to a significant degree, for example. So what we've actually been doing is depopulating rural areas in a way which is undermining significant services, at the same time as we've been changing our labour requirements to need people who have more sophisticated requirements themselves. Typically, someone who's now coming to manage a farm will have a partner who has their own career, and it may not be a rural career necessarily. They will have expectations for what their children should be able to get in terms of education and out-of-school activity, which it's less and less easy to deliver. So I actually think there's a dialogue that has to take place between rural New Zealand and the councils that serve it, not about the issue of how do we deal with the rates and is it capital value versus land value, what do you do about differentials, and how does forestry as opposed to pastoral farming, carrier load and so on. It's about understanding the needs of the agricultural sector long term for strong, viable services which currently are being undermined by the way agricultural productivity is going. So I think there's quite a large strategic debate about how do we create the environment, including the capability of the local authorities to provide services that don't necessarily look like they're serving farms, but are critical if your successor on your farm in 5 or 10 years' time wants to be able to recruit and retain staff.
I think that's a really good answer to you. I also think that if you take a very big idea, the idea has got many complexities, and that's a terrific question you asked. And each one is, I think, unique to the areas, and why wouldn't it be? And it needs serious consideration. But if you're going to build a big house, you need a damn good architect. And the architect of the Auckland whole super city was not Rodney Hyde, but Mark Ford and his team. There must have been 200 people there, and he picked and borrowed from the councils and from local government and others some of the best thinkers on how would this work. And so your question, and I think it was, as I said, was good, Peter's response was also good, you've got to think differently outside the perimeters of what we're thinking of now. If you're going to go there, you've really got to go there. You've got to do liftoff. And you need smart thinking, beyond what we're even thinking of now, into the next 20 years of technology and the just sheer brilliance and change of everything. And the back paddock and the cemetery will soon be merged. You won't be happy about it probably, but maybe you'll never be quite happy about that, but it will happen. And you'll go, well, bugger it, but I got all the roads fixed. I think it's about delivery. It's about bigger delivery. And I hear what you're saying. Yes, there is some unfairness, and there will be unfairness, and there'll be some grief and a hell of a lot of pain. But finally, it's a bit like the French Revolution. A small group of people did something amazing, and it kind of delivered something bigger than they ever thought possible. And that's what the Auckland experiences is. I think it still amazes us, and will continue to amaze us into our rest homes and all that kind of stuff, when we look back and say, my God, we did it. We took the risk. A very interesting thing about when Darwin came back with his theory, no one really believed him, the world of science at that time, because the risk was so great when he published his book on the origin of species. It was such a huge risk. It was so ridiculous, and yet it was so right. And somehow, in the way I think, this makes that kind of sense.